What's going on, y'all? It's Adam for Beyond the Grid. Welcome back to my channel for another tutorial. Usually in my tutorials, what I do is I show you how to edit a photo, but in this one, I want to take things back to the basics and show you how you can switch out of that auto mode and into that manual mode and how you can nail that perfect exposure every time. But if you close your eyes. So before we jump into this, I just want to explain really quickly why I think you should be shooting into manual rather than auto. And it's basically because auto is allowing the camera to decide all the settings for you and you're just there for the ride. And in manual, you're pretty much the captain of everything. You're choosing everything. You're saying how you want your style to look. So when we want to switch our camera into manual mode, all you're going to have to do is on the top, you're going to see an auto or an M. You can switch into the M. You're also going to see three other modes, which are indicated by S, A, and P. And all this is that you're giving priority to either your shutter, your aperture, or a programmed auto. And to break that down a little bit further, all you're doing is you're going to be selecting your shutter speed if you put it on the S, and your camera is going to automatically select your aperture. Or if you click it on the A, you select your aperture and the camera will automatically select the shutter speed. And for the purpose of this tutorial, we're going to be leaving it in the M unless I adjust it otherwise, just to show you specifically how one of these settings is going to be used. So let's jump into this and let's start with aperture. Now to break aperture into super simple layman's terms, hold up your camera, look inside, and you'll see this little tiny hole. Well, that's your aperture ring. Now that hole is going to control the amount of light that comes in and out. So if you make the hole bigger, obviously more light's going to be allowed in. And if you make the hole really small, less light's going to be allowed in. Now on my A7 III, I can control this aperture ring by using my index finger and turning it to the right or left. And as you can see, the aperture ring is going to either grow or get smaller depending on how I turn it. Now the size of that ring is going to be controlled in a numerical number called an f-stop. When you look on the back of your screen, you're going to see an F and then a number behind it. The smaller the number, the wider the hole. The bigger the number, the smaller the hole. Now let's take this into a practical thing. As you guys can see, when I focus on this light, you guys are going to notice that it's a little bit dark and underexposed, but I'm sitting in an f22. Now if I crank that down and open it wide to an f2.8, you're going to see the image grow and get super bright. Well, that's because the wider the hole, the more light's going to be allowed in. So now let's take this knowledge of aperture and exposure and put it into practical use. So as you guys can see with this photo right here, I shot it in f5.6 and it's a little bit dark or underexposed and I need to fix that. So all I have to do is I have to adjust my aperture, drop it to a lower f-stop number, which in turn is going to open up my rings a little bit, allow more light to hit the sensor, and boom, properly expose the photo. Now aperture doesn't just control the amount of light that's going to come into your photo, it's also going to control your depth of field. Now depth of field pretty much means the amount of photo that's going to be in focus and the amount of the background that's going to be blurred out. So let's say you're shooting in a super wide open or low f-stop, you're going to notice that only a portion of your photo is going to be in focus, a very small amount, and the rest of the background is going to get blurred out. Now let's say you shorten up your aperture or make it super small and higher up your f-stop, you're going to notice that more of your photo is going to become in focus. Now I understand that that's a little bit complicated and a little bit hard to understand, so let's take into practical use. As you guys can see, when I have my Lego guys set up here and I have a super low f-stop, which is an f2.8, you guys will notice that only the front character is going to be in focus. Now as I open up my f-stop, you guys will also notice that more of the characters become in focus, and that's because more of my depth of field is opening up. So now that we have a good understanding of how we can control how much light comes in and hits our sensor, let's move on to the next subject, which is going to talk about how long our sensor is going to be exposed to that light by talking about shutter speed. So just like with aperture, I'm going to give you guys a quick explanation of what shutter speed is, and put it basically, it's just that, it's the speed of your shutter. Doesn't really tell you much, so let's break it down a little bit further. What the shutter is it's going to be a curtain that covers up your sensor, and whenever you trigger, take a photo, it's going to open and close and expose your sensor to light. That exposure is going to be measured in time, which is measured in fractions of a second. When you look on the back of your camera, you're going to notice that this fraction of a second is going to be in the bottom left, well at least on my Sony, and you can see right here it's 1/4, which means that it's 1/4 of a second. Now I can increase this by spinning the wheel and bring it all the way up to, let's say, 1/4000, which is going to be lightning quick, and it's going to only expose that sensor for a fraction or a millisecond. Now, if you lower that and let's say you go back to the 1/4, what's going to happen is it's going to open and close a little bit slower, which means that your sensor is going to be exposed to light for a longer period of time. Okay, if you guys are still with me here, make sure you guys are hitting that like button because I'm going to break it down one more time to explain why this is so important to your exposure of your photo. So let's look at the difference in time from 1/4 of a second to 1/4000. 1/4 means that it's going to open and close nice and slow, or slower than 1/4000, right? Now, that opening and closing of that curtain is going to be what's going to be controlling how long your sensor is exposed to light. The longer your sensor is exposed to light means the brighter your image. So 1/4 is going to be a brighter image than 1/4000 because of that time of that exposure to the sensor. Now, just like with aperture controlled depth of field, shutter speed's also going to control motion blur. When you have a subject that's moving, you're going to want a faster shutter speed because you want it to open and close quickly to catch the movements. Now let's take that and actually move it to practical use, and let's move to the flame. It's super dark and underexposed because I've got my shutter speed cranked really high. Now as I drop my shutter speed and slow it down, you guys can notice that the exposure is going to become more correct. Now let's talk about motion blur. When I take this photo right here, you're going to notice that it's super sharp and super crisp. But if I slow down my shutter speed, the flame's actually going to be moving and the camera cannot capture it crisply, so you're going to notice a blur in the photo. I hope that makes sense. Now, let's say you get those two dialed in and you're still underexposed because you're shooting in a dark area. That's where ISO comes in. Okay, so just like with aperture and shutter speed, let's break ISO down a little bit so you guys get a better understanding of what it is and how it's going to affect your photo's exposure. So what ISO really is it's your camera's ability to create fake light. Doesn't really say much, so let's break it down a little bit further so you guys get a better understanding. So what ISO is it's your camera's software to adjust the sensitivity of its sensor to the light that it's exposed to. So what that pretty much means is at a higher ISO means that the sensitivity of your sensor is going to be a lot higher, which means a brighter image, where at a lower ISO, the sensitivity is a little bit slower, which means a better quality image. Okay, so let's break this down one more time because I want to explain to you how this is going to affect the quality of your photo. So let's say you're shooting at a low ISO. What's going to happen is the sensitivity of your camera is going to be nice and long, which means that it's going to have as much time to read that data and write it. So let's say you bump your ISO up, what's going to happen is that camera is only going to be reading that sensitivity at a super fast rate, which means that you're going to get grain in your photo. Now, if you guys don't know what grain is, let me show you a side-by-side photo. So what grain is it's pretty much digital noise, which is apparent when you start to shoot in higher ISOs. As you can see on the image on the left, which is shot at a low ISO, the image is super sharp and then the background is nice and crisp. Where when you go to a higher ISO, which is the image on the right, you'll notice little dots everywhere, and that's your camera's sensor trying to read that data. Okay, so now you guys can see how all three of those things are going to work in unison to create a perfectly exposed photo, and how when you adjust one of them, you're going to need to compensate with one of the other ones. So let's do a quick little recap for you guys. So when we talk about aperture, we're talking about the amount of light that's going to be coming in. When we talk about shutter speed, we're going to be talking about the amount of time that sensor is going to be exposed to the light. And when we talk about ISO, it's your sensitivity of your sensor to the light that it's exposed to. Now with each one, remember that you're going to be affecting something else. So you're going to be affecting your depth of field, your blur, or your grain in your photo by over adjusting one of them. So I hope this video was instructive and you guys learned something in it. If you guys did, make sure you guys are hitting that like button. If you guys got any comments or questions, leave a comment down below. If you guys are not a subscriber, why aren't you? Hit that subscribe button. And until next time, take care, everybody.